The history of the Fighters Guild, detailing the events leading up to the foundations of the Sifim, now known as the Fighters Guild. In the 283rd year of the Second Era, potentate Versudushai was faced with a disintegrating empire. The vassal kingdoms throughout Tamriel had reached a new height of rebellion, openly challenging his rule. They refused his taxes and led sorties against the imperial garrisons throughout the land. At the destruction of his fortress in Dunstar, he gathered the imperial council in what would be called the Council of Barmont, after the town south of Dunstar where they met. There, the potentate declared Catholic and universal martial law. The princes of Tamriel would dissolve their armies or face his wrath. The next 37 years were perhaps the bloodiest in the violent history of Tamriel. In order to crush the last of the royal armies, Versudushai had to sacrifice many of his best legions, as well as spend nearly every last piece of gold in the imperial treasury. But he accomplished the unthinkable. For the first time in history, there was one bad army in the land, and it was his own. The problems that immediately surfaced were almost as staggering as the triumph itself. The potentate had impoverished this land by his war, for the vanquished kingdoms had also spent the last of their gold in defense. Farmers and merchants alike had their livelihood ruined. Before, the princes of Tamriel would not pay his taxes. Now they could not. The only persons who benefit from the war were criminals, who preyed upon the ruins of the lawless land, without fear of arrest now that all the local guards and the militia were gone. It was a crisis that Akavir had seen coming long before he destroyed the last of his subject armies, but for which he had no solution. He could not allow his vassals their own armies again, but the land was deeper and deeper into the stew of anarchy than it had ever been before. His army sought to fight the rise of crime, but a central authority was no threat against the local underworld. In the dawn of the year 320, a kinsman of Versudushai, Demonetization, the Iron, presented himself with a host of companions before the potentate. It was who suggested an order of mercantile warriors for hire, who could be hired by nobility in lieu of a standard army. The employment would be temporary, and a percentage of their fees would go to the potentate government, thus putting self on two of Versudushire's greatest pains. So it was then called the Sifim, after the Seishi word for soldiers. The organization that was to be known as the Fighters Guild had been born. Demonetization, the Iron, initially believed that the entirety of the order should be composed of Akaviri. This belief of his is not disputed by any historian, so his motivation is often debated. The traditional, simple explanation is that he knew his countrymen well, trusted them, and felt that their tradition of fighting for profit would be of use. Others believe with reason that he and the potentate sought to use the order to effectively complete the conquest of Tamriel begun over 500 years earlier. When Akavir attacked Tamriel in the 2703rd year of the First Era, they had been beaten back by the Reman dynasty. Now they had a potentate on the throne, and with Demonetization machinations, the local armies would also be Akaviri. What they had failed to do by combat, they would have successfully accomplished by patience. Many scholars suggest that it was a traditional stratagem of the immortal snake man, the Seishi of Akavir, who always had time on their side. The point, however, is largely academic. So the Sifim did establish themselves in the kingdom's neighboring Cyrodiil, it became quickly apparent that local warriors were needed. Part of the problem was simply that there were not enough Akaviri for the work that needed to be done. Another part was that the snake men did not understand the geography and politics of the regions they were assigned. It was evident that some non-Akaviri were needed in the Sifim, and by the midpoint of the year, 3 Nords, a warrior, sorceress and a rogue, were admitted into the order. The knight, whose name has been lost in the sands of time, was also a great armorer, and probably did more to strengthen the organization than anyone but Demonetization himself. As has often been stated, the Akaviri, particularly the Seishi, understood weaponry better than armor, Even if they could not wear it themselves, the knight was able to explain to the other Sifim what the weaknesses were in their opponent armor, explaining to them how many joints there were in a pauldron and a greave, and the differences between eketones and armakins, gorgets and glyceryms, pellets and passguards, tabards and tessits. With this knowledge, they made long strides in defeating the brigands, doing far better than their meager numbers would suggest. It is a joke among historians that if Akever had had a Nord armorer in their employ in the First Era, they would have won the invasion. The success of these first 3 outsiders to the Sifim opened the door for more local members. Before the year was through, Daenerys Vess has spread his business throughout the Empire. Young men and women joined his new order en masse for a variety of reasons, including desperately, poverty, love of action of an adventure, or simply to aid their crime-stricken neighbors. They received training and were immediately put to work helping the aristocracy problems, assuming the roles of guards and soldiers within their locality. The early success of the Sifim in combating crime and defeating local monsters so inspired potentate Versailles that he entertained representatives from other organizations interested in the imperial sanction. Though formed much earlier, the Mages Guild has always been viewed with suspicion by the government. In the 321st year of the Second Era, the potentate gave his approval to the Guild's act, officially sanctioning the mages together with the Guild of Tinkers, Cobblers, Prostitutes, Scribes, Architects, Brewers, Vintners, Weavers, Ratcatchers, Furriers, Cooks, Astrologers, Healers, Tailors, Minsters, Barristers, and the Sifim. In the chapter, they were no longer called the Sifim, however, bowing to the name it had become known as by people. They were to be called the Fighters Guild. All the guilds and those that followed by later sections throughout the Second and Third Eras would be protected and encouraged by the Empire of Cyrodiil, recognizing their value to the people of Tamriel. All would be required to pay to expand their influence through the land. The Empire was strengthened by their presence, and the Empire coffers were filled once again. Shortly after Versailles' death, only 3 years after to the Guild Act, his heir, Severin Chorak, allowed the reforming of local armies. The Fighters Guild was no longer the principal arm of the local aristocracy, but their wars had already been established. So there were many certainly strong individuals who sought their own fortunes in the past. Many historians have suggested that Daenerys Vess was the ancestors in the spirit of the modern phenomenon of the adventurer, those men and women who dedicated their lives to questing for fame and fortune. Thus, all of the debt of gratitude to the Fighters Guild, not only its members, but also the people who have been held by its natural policy of offering strong arms for a fee within the boundaries of the law. Without them, there would be no guilds of any kind, and it may be argued, no model for even the independent adventurer.